Welcome back, everybody. As we wait to jump live in the Timothy Jones Jr. case, because they're currently on break, let's talk about another trial that we're going to be live in today. We are going to be back in California for the trial against Kellen Winslow II. Winslow has been accused of a number of sex-related crimes from 5 different women between 2003 and 2018. So far, we've heard from 3 of the 5 Jane Does. Winslow's defense argues that sex between their client and alleged victims 1 and 2, though, was consensual and it was paid for. And let's get into that. That's where we want to begin. And we want to start right now with the cross-examination of Jane Doe number 1. Now, Andrew, look, I get it. It's tricky cross-examining an alleged rape victim, but they are seriously attacking her credibility. I mean, from everything from her ability to making assumptions that she thought he had a gun because of his race, to the idea of their positioning, to the idea of she had trouble identifying him in his car, to the idea of how they pointed out that she was lying about being an alcoholic. I mean, how did they do at cross-examining her?
I think this is very effective. I have the majority of my cases are sexual assault cases. And so there's some very tricky kind of sensitive ways that you've got to go about a cross-examination. In this case, we're going to see each one of the different techniques, I think, through the different alleged victims. In this case, we have a credibility attack based on essentially a physical impossibility or an improbability of the circumstances based on how it went down. So what we have with her having to get over the fence and having inconsistent statements at the preliminary hearing, having a certain delay, having issues identifying, that all is very effective. We don't see an attorney who's yelling and screaming. We do see him parsing through the very specific issues. That's acceptable. I think if the tone had gotten heightened, if he had been more aggressive in the way that he was confronting her, then we have an issue. But this is what the justice system is about.
And now, Terry, if the jury believes that she was not credible and they don't take her word for it and they ultimately say, you know what, she made a lot of this up, it was consensual, does that affect the testimony of the other 4, how they view it?
It could, because the jury could think that they're piling it all on. I think one witness shouldn't affect the testimony of the others, but it absolutely could. You know, here we have several of the Jane Does who didn't identify him properly. And then, as you know, there is also the claim that it was consensual. With Jane Doe number 1, I agree that the cross-examination is going very well. And not only that, she just doesn't seem sympathetic. The way she's answering the questions, she doesn't seem as though she was afraid or in any way hurt. So I think that's going to help with the defense.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because not only did the defense attempt to point out to the jury that Jane Doe number 1 possibly had a number of opportunities to run and escape and get away, but they also pointed out an instance, as Terry said, of mistaken identity from a preliminary hearing earlier in this case. Well, Andrew, it's never good for a witness to point out not only the wrong person in court, but you pointed to his attorney. What do you make of that?
It's, in this case, kind of a comedy of errors in that we have DNA that matches them, if I'm not mistaken, but it does show how unreliable she is. And so I think ultimately, when you're talking about, is this a good allegation in that it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, what they're establishing is that she has a claim that she's made, that she had certain feelings in the moment, that she was compelled to engage in these sex acts. What we have, though, for the defense is that the reliability of how she perceives things, how she thinks it through, it's not there. I mean, she doesn't even have the grasp to be able to put the right face to the person who did this. That's not to say that she wasn't sexually assaulted. It's to say that the reliability of her testimony and the quality of what she can present to the jury in trying to convince them beyond a reasonable doubt that it happened, it's just not reliable enough.
Yeah, it's a high standard. We keep talking about beyond the reasonable doubt. And Terry, here's the thing. If you look at all the victims, 4 out of the 5 were women of age. And that's an interesting point, because the reason I ask that, you could say on one hand, hey, all these women came together, similar stories, you know, they all made up everything and they all came together. But the other way of looking at it is, isn't it strange that he has this kind of MO? And the fact that you have all these different kind of women, but they similar kind of circumstances, how do you think that plays? Does it help his case or hurt his case, the similarities in the victims?
I think the similarities definitely hurt his case, and I think the prosecution is happy to have all of these women testifying in the same case at the same time because it shows a pattern of behavior. But as you were saying earlier, and Andrew as well, there's so much doubt here. And, you know, if the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt and there's so much doubt here, then I think there's a very good chance that the defense is going to be able to make their case.
Well, we got a lot of different victims over a 16-year span, multiple incidents, and it's a bizarre case. Okay, so Andrew, similar to Jane Doe number 1, she claims that the defendant raped her, but she was a little bit of a different witness. How do you think she did compared to the testimony of Jane Doe number 1?
I thought what was incredibly compelling and credible was this long-term, I guess, relationship, this dance that took place where he would approach her through his vehicle, talk to her a little bit, offer her something. There's no way to contest whether that happened or not, I think. I mean, obviously the defense could say that she's exaggerating that, but it just sounds so real. It sounds like something that happened. So it makes it, leading into the description of the actual sexual assault that she alleges, that makes it more credible because the premise, the predicate to it just feels correct.
Terri, isn't it real though in the sense that he's admitting that he had sex with these women? He's admitting he cheated on his wife and he picked up strangers off the street to have sex with them. So was that a good strategy on the part of the defense there to say, hey, we know who our client is. He's not denying even knowing these women, but he was with them.
I think it was a good strategy. What else can they say? I think that the fact that there are all these people who are claiming that they either had sex or he was inappropriate in front of them, they're going to have to say, okay, we did do this, but it was consensual. It's a very good argument. It's
also very good to hear if there's some corroborating evidence, if there's supporting evidence. And Jane Doe number 2, she may have had a very important corroborating witness, a friend who saw her both on the day before and the day after the alleged assault. So let's hear that testimony from that friend right now. An important witness there for the prosecution. Andrew, what did you make of that?
Corroboration really is key, isn't it, Jesse? The idea that you've got somebody who's coming in the next day and sees this individual in a state of being that's just not right. Isn't it interesting how lawyers have to kind of get around the idea of getting to the question, did she seem like herself? And it took so many questions for the prosecutor to get there, but she said she just didn't seem like herself. That's critical corroboration. The idea that something not right happened in the time in between. Does it mean it was sexual assault? Does it mean that it was something that she just wasn't comfortable with, but she did consensually? It doesn't answer that question directly, but it puts it all in a time period where it eliminates the ability for her to essentially be fabricating this for some sort of grand plan. And that's, I think that's one of the things that the defense is going to struggle with this Jane Doe.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because one other thing to note is she reported about this the next day. We learned that Jane Doe number 1 reported the incident 4 days later. And then Jane Doe number 3, who accuses the defendant of exposing himself to her while she was outside cutting her flowers, she reported the same day. These are really important facts to establish here in determining whether or not these women are in fact credible. Well, there's a lot to talk about in this case as well as our 2 other trials here on the network. Remember, we are live in 3 different courtrooms here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back right after this.